I've just been watching the film Hotel Rwanda, starring Don Cheadle in the title role, or not the title role, but as the principal character, Paul Rusesabagina. If you haven't seen this film, I should say it's not a sort of film you want to watch if you're a very sensitive person, because it deals with the Rwandan Genocide of 1994. Before I talk a bit about the film and other issues I want to discuss in this video, I should give you a bit of background if you don't know. So the Rwandan Genocide was an absolutely horrible event that happened for a few months in the middle of 1994. It was arguably the worst genocide of modern times, by which I mean within my lifetime. As many as 1 million people killed. There had already been a civil war going on in Rwanda, which began in 1990, and that was between the Hutu-led government and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. The Hutu-led government, Hutu is one of the main tribes of Rwanda, the other is the Tutsis, had been supported by the French government. That's something I'm going to talk about later on in the video. And there's been a long history of Hutu-Tutsi tensions, and there'd actually been previous violence, which is less documented than the Rwandan genocide. But basically, regarding this specific civil war, began in 1990, and it finally came to a peace agreement in 1993, because international pressure was put on the Hutu government of Juvenal Habyarimana. This was a roadmap to implement the Arusha Accords that would eventually create power-sharing government with the RPF. But peace was shattered. The short-lived peace was shattered in April 1994 when Habyarimana, along with the Burundian president Cyprien, let me get his name correct, Cyprien Ntaryamira, I believe, Cyprien Ntaryamira. Apologies if my pronunciation is bad. I always say this in videos around other countries because I don't know if my pronunciation is right. But basically, 2 presidents shot down, killing all on board. It crashed into whilst it was landing in Kigali. Well, that basically led to a bloodbath. Hutu extremists blamed the RPF for shooting down the plane, and that's I don't know if that has ever been fully established who really did shoot down the plane, but basically the RPF was blamed, and this led to the genocide we now know today as the Rwandan Genocide. Over a period of just less than 100 days, anywhere from 500,000 to well over 1 million people were massacred, in some very, very sadistic scenes. It's hard to really imagine the sort of scale of bloodletting that happened in those days, and when you put this in the context of the fact that Rwanda is a very small country, it's got a population now of about 12 million. Back in 1994 it couldn't have been much more than 8 million. That's like 1/8 of the entire population being eradicated. If you try to comprehend that, most other conflicts that get focused today, the death tolls, whilst awful, still are only a fraction of the population. When you put into context that the scale of the Rwandan genocide in the context of the overall population, it is one of the worst acts of human cruelty in human history, basically. When you consider Rwanda is a very, very small country. One thing that is sometimes overlooked today, that actually this was not the first genocide regarding the Hutu-Tutsi tensions, which is an understatement to say the least. I mean, when I say tensions, I'm talking about outright racial hatred, which was not helped by Belgian colonialism. The Belgians actually exploited those differences for their own ends, and that's an issue that was covered in the film. But basically, earlier in Burundi, there had also been a genocide. I believe on that occasion it was Hutus that were the main victims. Burundi is a neighbouring country to Rwanda, also a small impoverished country, and like Rwanda, it suffered a civil war in the early 1990s, and an event that also became known as genocide. So Burundi actually suffered two genocides in 1972 and 1993. Collectively, those genocides kill well over 300,000 people. Burundi's civil war only really ended in 2008, and they're still far from a stable situation. Rwanda has basically been trying to confront the ghosts of its past from 1994. So you have two small landlocked African countries that suffered massive suffering, massive violence in the second half of the 20th century in sporadic outbreaks of Hutu-Tutsi violence. This then spread over into the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 1995-96 there was the Great Lakes crisis, and then this eventually spiraled into the First Congo War, which itself then spiraled into the Second Congo War. Now the important thing to recognise is all of these conflicts are interlinked, and they all go back to this source, which is Hutu-Tutsi racial hatred. And it's hard to comprehend this sort of mentality, and the film I think really documents as well. This is a film, by the way, if you haven't seen it. It was made in 2004, 10 years after the event, and like I say, it was based on a man called Paul Rusesabagina. This is his autobiography. So I have the film, I have his autobiography. Basically, he was a Hutu hotel manager, and he had a lot of connections with the powers to be in Rwanda at the time. But due to circumstance, due to sheer courage, due to a number of different situations, he found himself shielding 1,268 Tutsi refugees along with moderate Hutus. One thing that needs to be remembered about this genocide is that whilst the Tutsis were the main target, they had a code word, cockroaches and tall trees, because the Tutsi were supposedly taller in stature. But what's forgotten is there was also a lot of moderate Hutus massacred, those who didn't want to kill their neighbours, those who weren't blinded by this extreme racial hatred of the other ethnic group. So it's hard to comprehend the sheer bloodletting that was going on in Rwanda in those few hellish months of 1994. Now, one of the worst aspects of this was the absolute inactivity or supposed inactivity of the international community. I say supposed because it's I don't buy the sort of fact that world leaders just stood back and didn't care. I don't believe that, but I think there was a lot of questions that need to be answered, and definitely, in fact, far from not caring, a lot of world governments actually have blood on their hands from the Rwanda genocide. France has often been accused of this. The Mitterrand government had a policy of supporting francophone governments to exert their influence in Africa because they wanted it to sort of balance out the anglophone governments. So it's unquestionable that France supplied weapons to the Hutu militias. One of the most notorious militias was the Interahamwe. There's another one that was known as the it's not as well known as the Interahamwe, and it formed later on, but it was known as the, bear with me a second, this was a Hutu paramilitary, and it became known as I'm trying to find it. There was another militia group that was similar to the Interahamwe, but the Interahamwe was the main militia group, and it basically translated as those who work together. This has been active across this part of Africa, and especially in Rwanda. They're currently regarded as a terrorist group hiding in the Congo and the Ugandan forest. Uganda is another country that got sucked into this, because all of these sort of conflicts and the Rwanda genocide all then merged into the Second Congo War, which was an absolutely devastating conflict that has been called the Great War of Africa and the deadliest conflict since World War II. Deadlier than Vietnam, deadlier than Korea, deadlier than any other conflict, deadlier than the Iran-Iraq War in terms of deaths and war-related deaths. Now I have to say that includes issues like preventable disease, famine, that sort of thing. that are not directly linked to violence, but nevertheless have been exacerbated even by the standards of sub-Saharan Africa because of the conflict situation. That's a conflict that still hasn't been resolved. There's still sporadic rebellions break out, like the M23 rebellion in the earlier part of this decade that only got sort of wound down at the end of last year. Basically, it still remains a powder keg. Those countries, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, is a powder keg, and it can still, whilst the situation today is probably not as bad as it was in the mid-90s, there's still deep impoverishment, and the circumstances could still boil up at any moment because there's still massive suspicion on all sides of the other side. So it's not a situation that this would be incomprehensible to happen again. I don't think it would happen on the scale of the 1994 genocide, but there's clearly a situation there where conflict could break out at any moment. The DRC, unlike Burundi and Rwanda, is a massive country. It covers a huge area, and it's incredibly difficult to govern. And there's some massive problems there. Some of those problems include massive poverty. It's one of the world's poorest countries. It's got something like less than 100 kilometers of paved road or something like that. And yet it covers an area more than twice the size of France, I believe. Almost 70 million people live there. So it's a very difficult country to govern. Massive poverty, huge illiteracy. Rape is a massive problem. There are tens of thousands of women who suffered war rape also during the Rwandan Genocide. Children were targeted in that genocide because it was the Hutu power extremists sort of took the logic that they would cut off the next generation. But the problem is, this genocide, it didn't just happen out of the blue. It was sparked off by years of suspicion about the Tutsis, and bearing in mind that Hutus suffered in the previous genocide, which is of course no justification, but to understand this sort of mentality, I think you need to look at the context of the history of that region. So it didn't just blow out of this cauldron didn't just develop in 1994 like that. There was a historical context. But the thing is, this is only 20 years ago. This is well within living memory. Bill Clinton often said that one of his greatest regrets as president was not being able to do more about that. There's a character in the film, and in the film he isn't given the same name, but it's obvious that he's based on the Canadian UN peacekeeper general, Romeo Dallaire. Now, Dallaire was a man who was rendered powerless, not through his own character, but simply by the shackles put on him by decisions made by the UN. And it's my understanding that he suffered years of alcoholism and almost like post-traumatic stress from the sort of things that he saw and the things that he felt powerless to do. I mean, it would have put psychological pressure on anyone, seeing massacres and not being allowed to do anything about it, seeing women and children literally hacked to pieces and not being... So it's little wonder that that man suffered from this feeling of... I haven't read the book yet, but I've seen passages where Paul Rusesabagina says at that time the Rwandans couldn't understand why General Dallaire wasn't doing more, but in retrospect they realised that his hands were tied. This is one of the main questions that is often brought about the Rwandan genocide, which is, why did the international community do nothing? And looking back, it is shameful. There was culpability, like I've already mentioned, France had blood on its hands, but it wasn't just France. There was numerous other countries involved in arms deals with the Hutu government. China was involved in it. A lot of smaller European countries were involved in it. I believe Czechoslovakia was. So this wasn't something that it was just France that was culpable. Pretty much the international community has a guilty conscience about Rwanda. The United States, as a superpower of the time, obviously had the guilt of not being able to do more. But then again, this is where I think a lot of modern contemporary conflicts then raise serious questions. You know, in the Syrian Civil War, which is actually the deadliest conflict of this decade, of the 2010s, in terms of the number of people who've been killed, one of the most pressing questions throughout much of the war has been, why is the international community not caring? One thing that is very striking is that the last 10 years, especially since the days of Bush and Blair and the massive fallout from Iraq, is not criticism of why the West doesn't do anything, but is criticism that the West does too much. Especially third way leaders like Tony Blair, who took the approach of intervention and yet have been vilified ever since for taking that approach. So it's true to say that there's you know, if I was a Syrian citizen and I saw my family killed by the forces of Assad, and of course people talk today about ISIS, but the point is ISIS only exploited the situation because there was a stalemate. There was this quagmire situation brought about by the fact that Russia and China vetoed UN action. So I think it's incredibly hypocritical for Russia and China to point the finger at the West for a lot of the conflicts going on in the world, when actually they are guilty of prolonging the suffering. Because my own feeling about the matter is, had the West been in a position to arm moderate dissidents in Syria, notably the Free Syrian Army, more moderate aspects of the Free Syrian Army, it's true that they have been arming them, but if they had been able to do that much more, and if there had been military intervention in Syria, which I accept would have been massively controversial, then there's a chance this conflict could have ended earlier. Of course, that's only one speculation, and that could be, I'm only presenting one possible outcome. The other possible outcome, of course, is that it is as it is, which is a bloody civil war, and you know, there's indirect involvement from Western countries because the Free Syrian Army has received weapons, but there's no boots on the ground, and it's the exact opposite of Iraq. You haven't had military intervention on a large scale except for providing rebels with weapons. Of course, ISIS has moved in, and now there's huge criticism of the West of, oh, you're funding these Islamist fascists, look at what they're doing now. You have Christians fleeing the Middle East, you have these bastards threatening to commit female genital mutilation of thousands of young women. You know, there's no question about it. ISIS is a horrible organisation, and it is right that the international community is concerned about their rise. But one thing that really bugs me is when the average Tom or Sally sort of says, oh, why doesn't the government do this? But then the very same people would point round and say, why are you doing that? In other words, if a Western government, and I say Western government because it's specifically Western governments that get attacked for this, if they do nothing, if they don't intervene in any way, which is, I don't believe that's ever the case, there's always some form of intervention, but let's say that on the ground there's a perception that nothing is happening, then there's anger and contempt, like, oh, they don't care, Syrian blood is worthless. But if they do intervene, as we did in Libya, then the likes of China and Russia then point the finger and say, oh, look at Western behaviour, interfering in other countries' internal affairs. From the Chinese perspective, it's a fear that they're going to be scrutinised, because China is led by an authoritarian regime. Well, my message to China is you've got nothing to worry about. The US and the UK is in no rush to have a war with China, so I don't think that's really a legitimate concern. But basically, there's a huge amount of hypocrisy from what the international community seems to expect, because you can't have it both ways. Either there is intervention or there isn't. And if there is intervention, then the question must be, well, in what form does that take? Now, my response to all the allegations of the West interfering in Syria was, Okay, well, yeah, I can understand the controversy, but look at Rwanda. Rwanda is a prototype for pretty much every conflict that has followed, on the grounds that, and Rwanda wasn't the last. I mean, you had 7,000 young men and boys, well, men and boys generally, killed at Srebrenica the following year. Um, you've had other events that could be, you've had Darfur since then. I'm talking about events that could be described as genocide. A quick word about Gaza in relation to this. I don't want to trivialize Gaza, but I do take issue with this propaganda that's being thrown around that the Israelis are committing genocide in Gaza. Now, if I was a Palestinian, fine, I can understand their anger. But for other people looking in and saying that, it's not genocide. Now, I know that's a controversial statement, but let's be clear about this. Genocide is a systematic, deliberate attempt to kill off a specific group of people. Israel has blood on its hands, but Israel is not attempting to commit a systematic murder of the Palestinian people. You don't have IDF soldiers going in and saying, you're a Palestinian child, so I'm going to kill you in order to kill off your bloodline. And for people to throw around the word genocide in this context, I think is irresponsible. What happened in Rwanda was genocide. What is happening in Gaza is a state of war. And it's very important that the terminology is, the rhetoric is accurate, because otherwise, one of the problems is when this word genocide is thrown around, it actually then sparks not superstition, that's the wrong word, but suspicion and hatred of the other. And that's already taking hold, because you have Jewish businesses being attacked around France. So what's happening in Gaza is horrible, but I don't think genocide's an appropriate term. It's a conflict, it's a war, but it's not genocide. So what's the point of this video? I think it should be somber reflection on the implications of what the international community should do in light of these situations. And if you're sitting there saying, oh, the West always sticks its nose into other countries' affairs, okay, I accept that there is a fair argument with that. But if you're going to use that logic, then I would ask you, well, okay, are you the sort of person who would then turn around and say, oh, why does the international community not care? In other words, if you're going to point the finger at Western governments and say they intervene in these situations, my question would be, what exactly should the international community do? When you have a madman like Colonel Gaddafi killing his own people, when you have Bashar Assad killing his own people, and people seem to have selective memory. You know, they talk about how awful ISIS is, and no one disputes that. ISIS is a horrible fascist organisation. But people conveniently forget that at the start of the Syrian civil war, it was Assad that was killing civilians en masse. So I have a problem with this idea that just because you have a vile terrorist organisation doesn't mean there isn't governmental players as well. In the case of Syria, yes, ISIS is a horrible terrorist organisation, and they now possibly pose an even bigger threat than Al-Qaeda. I believe they've got to the stage where they have got, not because of anything the West has done, but largely because of Russian and Chinese actions in blocking UN action against Assad. Had there been intervention earlier on, there is a strong chance that this war would have wound down, or at least the Free Syrian Army would have got into a position where they could have taken power in Syria rather than ISIS. I'm not saying that as a fact, I'm just speculating. I might be completely wrong. But I believe the lessons for Rwanda have to be, I'm not going to be so naive and come out with a utopian sort of logic that it should be the war to end all the wars. World War I and World War II taught us that that's naive thinking. But at the very least, it should teach the international community that there are certain times when intervention should be justified. Military intervention. It's all very well saying humanitarian intervention, sending in food aid, sending in that sort of thing. But when you're dealing with a sadistic organisation, a sadistic group of people who are hell-bent on genocide, then sometimes a military option is sadly the only one, and I think that might well be the case in Rwanda. Now, I'm not saying in retrospect there would have been any easy answers. Whether that would have been the United States and other Western countries then sending weapons to the RPF, I don't know. But you know, it's easy to come out with statements like, oh, please everyone, shake hands and have peace. That's just naive. When you have that level of hatred, just pleading for peace is just... And that's not to disrespect pacifists, but I just think it's very naive, and it doesn't actually address the issues. Before you have peace in any conflict, you have to address the underlying issues. You can't just say, this is a horrible situation, please everyone make up. It doesn't work like that. And that applies to pretty much any conflict. So, 20 years on, this should be the legacy of Rwanda. Questions about what exactly the international community should do in situations where an authoritarian government, an authoritarian force of some sort, whether it be some sort of militia or junta, or any group of people who are hell-bent on hurting innocent men, women and children because of their ethnicity, because of their political persuasion. It's very, very sobering thought. And I hope to God the world never sees another Rwanda again on that sort of scale. Plato said only the dead have seen the end of war. There will be other conflicts in the future. That's just inevitable. But at the very least, maybe we can prevent the circumstances of another Rwanda.